Welcome, everyone. I would like to welcome you at our joint event together with Pew Research Center and the Körber-Stiftung. We, as Globsec, would like to welcome you for this virtual briefing on the future of the transatlantic relations. We have a great panel that consists of three speakers. We will start with Washington, D.C., with Jacob presenting the outcomes of the joint opinion polls conducted together with Körber-Stiftung. We also have Joshua, who will then follow on what Jacob said, and he's sitting in Berlin. And last but not least, we will have Alena, who is in Bratislava, and will give a little bit of context of what does the outcomes that were conducted of the opinion polls conducted in the US and in Germany mean for Central Europe as well. We will, of course, as always, discuss the COVID-19 aspect of the events, and then we will be taking your questions. You can ask them via chat or on social media. I will be monitoring them, so feel free to join and ask any question that you deem important or intriguing. We have a good combination today. Globsec is a think tank, policy-oriented think tank based in Bratislava. We also have a fact tank from Washington, D.C., and we also have a foundation based in Germany, working from both Hamburg and Berlin. So I think this combination will really allow us to have a multi-stakeholder approach to issues and also bring come up with some interesting conclusion. Without further ado, I will give first the floor to Jacob. Please, Jacob, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kinga. Thank you for having me here. Appreciate it. So what I'm going to do is just go over the results of our survey that we did in the US in conjunction with the Körber Foundation in Germany. And then after that, I think I'll swing it over to Josh, but I'll just start that presentation now. So just give me a moment to share my screen. Everyone should be seeing the presentation now. Just turn it into a slideshow. So the name of this slide deck, Transatlantic Estrangement, with a question mark, because we're not really sure exactly how long this will last. Quickly, the methodology. I know there are a lot of words here. Basically, what this means is that we took this from multiple surveys from both 2020 and 2019. And some of it was done in Germany, some of it was done in the US, but all surveys are nationally representative samples of adults 18 and over. And if you have any more questions about the methodology for any of these surveys, feel free to ask at the end. But for now, just realize that they're all nationally representative surveys of people within the US and Germany. So one of the bigger findings that we've seen over the years is that Americans and Germans diverge sharply in their view of bilateral relations. On this question, as of 2019, when is the last time we asked this question, although we're planning to ask it again this year, 75% of Americans say that the relationship with Germany is good, but only 34% of Germans say that the relationship with the US is good. So there is quite a divergence here in terms of attitudes between the US and Germany. Americans are overall still pretty positive on the relationship, but there's been some change over time among the German public, and that shows in here. One reason why the Germans are maybe less happy with the relationship, they have a much more negative view of the US president. Confidence in the US president is down in the low teens and has been since Trump assumed office in early 2017. And you see that this is not unique in the history of the relationship between the US and Germany. Germans also had very little confidence in George W. Bush at the end of the Bush administration in 2008. So we've seen it before. It will be interesting to see what happens with this year's US election. If there is a change, what these numbers will do in terms of both favorable views of the US, which have remained a little higher than confidence in the US president. But it will definitely be interesting to see what happens next on this. And, you know, that's why we'll do a survey and sort of ask these questions again. One thing we also asked this year, we were able to ask about the coronavirus outbreak itself. So this is among Americans. And we asked about how various countries were dealing with the coronavirus outbreak. And what we found is that most Americans thought that Germans were doing a very good job of dealing with the outbreak. 65% say that you know, Germany is doing a good job of handling the coronavirus outbreak, which is much higher than Americans gave to their own country. Only 47% at the time, this was in late April, early May, said that the US was handling the coronavirus outbreak appropriately. But you also see here that there's a lot of negative views towards China's handling of the coronavirus outbreak, and that a lot is turned with many more negative views of China overall among Americans, especially in the last year. When it comes to partisan breaks on this question, you see that generally Democrats are a little more positive on the response to the coronavirus outbreak in South Korea, Germany, and China. This sort of encompasses normal partisan patterns that we see, where Democrats are a little more positive on Germany, South Korea than Republicans, and a little more positive on China than Republicans. So this is something we see in our data overall. I will say that the partisan gap on Germany is relatively small, especially compared to some of the other countries we ask about in our survey. So the China gap is a lot bigger. Republicans are much more negative on China than Democrats, although attitudes towards China, again, have deteriorated within the US overall. It's not just bipartisanship. Looking at how Americans and Germans see China, this is an interesting data point. You know, Americans are sort of split on whether it's more important for their country to have a close relationship to Germany and China. I think this shows that there's a lot of goodwill of Americans towards Germany because, you know, obviously China is a bigger trading partner. It's you know, a relationship it's much bigger and more complicated, but still Americans are actually split on whether it's important to have a close relationship with either Germany or China. Germans think a little differently, and the change over time is something interesting, which I'm sure Josh will talk more about in his presentation. But Germans are also actually split on this question in 2020, but they were not beforehand. One other question that we were able to ask on this April survey with Körber is whether people think that globalization is good for their country. Now, we did not define globalization for people, so there is a question of whether the respondents, you know, completely understood what we meant by it. But in this case, it's interesting to see that Americans are about split on whether globalization is a good or bad thing for their country. 47% say good, 44% say bad, but Germans are much more positive on globalization, where almost 6 in 10 Germans say that globalization is a good thing for their country versus only 1 in 3 that say it's bad. So again, you know, Americans are very split on this question, but Germans are very positive on globalization. That has a lot of, I think, effects on the future of the relationship with Europe when you look at it from the American perspective. But one thing that's also interesting is that in the United States, younger people are keener on globalization, as are those with a college education. This is actually a split we've been seeing, not just on some of these foreign policy issues, but in domestic politics. Young people in the US, more educated people in the US are really diverging from less educated and older members of society. And we've seen that in our political wins of the last couple of months as well. But it is something that also comes into play when we talk about foreign policy. Also of note, there wasn't much of a partisan gap on this question, which for American public opinion is very hard for there not to be a gap. We also asked on this survey for people to look forward. What do they think the world will look like after the coronavirus outbreak is over? And here, Americans are again pretty split. They're about a third say countries will cooperate more with other countries. About a third say everything will be the same as before the crisis. And about a third say countries will increase their focus on national interests. Germans, it's a little more on the side of countries will cooperate more with other countries. A plurality say that. But overall, there is, you know, pretty big divisions on what people think the world will look like after the coronavirus outbreak. And of course, we'll, you know, try to go back and ask people questions again as it becomes clearer what that post-coronavirus world will actually look like. And finally, just a couple slides on defense and troop deployments. We've asked this question since 2017 on whether Americans or Germans should spend more money on national defense. Americans, whether European allies should spend more on national defense, Germans on whether their own country should spend more. And the interesting thing here is that Americans less and less say that Europe should increase spending on national defense. When we first started asking the question, 45% plurality said this, but now that's down 10 percentage points to 35% who say that European allies should increase spending on national defense. So Americans are less concerned about defense spending in Europe than they were a couple years ago. Germans have moved around a little. Again, Josh could probably talk to this better, but now are sort of split on whether they want to increase it or keep the same. Finally, we asked this interesting question, which is more relevant nowadays, on whether US military bases in Germany are good for their own country's national security. So for American national security and for German national security. And here, overwhelming percentage of Americans say that those deployments are actually important for American national security. 56% say it's very important, but Germans are much more split on this. Only 15% say that that deployment is very important for national security, and a full 45% say it's not too important or not important at all. So those are some of the divergences in terms of public opinion in Germany and America. And with that, I will turn it over to Josh, who will take you through some more of the data.
Thank you very much, Jacob, for presenting this interesting data. I think what we've seen the most from your opinion polls as well was the perception on China exactly in the midst of the corona crisis. And in the EU, yeah, obviously the perception was changing, and especially at the beginning when member states were upset with the EU slow response, then it's step by step changed. But your results came at the moment when actually you could see the polarization of views on both sides of the Atlantic. So now I give the floor to Joshua. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Kinga, and thank you, Jacob. I'm going to give a bit more of a view from Germany. I'm going to do so, again, relying on the results from this publication, the Berlin Pulse, which is Körber-Stiftung's annual flagship report. And I want to start with a very obvious point, I think, namely that transatlantic relations are in crisis. And Jacob alluded to this already. We have almost 2/3 of Germans who think that relations with the US are either somewhat bad or even very bad. But you can also see it perhaps even more alarmingly in this statistic, namely that in 2020, only 10% of Germans actually see the United States as their most important partner in terms of foreign policy. And to show you the significance of this, I want to go back a little bit. Go back just 5 years, and you can see the two statistics aren't exactly comparable, but I think you can still see that there was quite a difference there. Back then, with multiple answers possible, a majority of 60% thought that the US was among the country's most important foreign policy partners. Also back then, what we can see is that, I do apologize because the graph is in German, but we can see that relations to the United States really weren't seen as a challenge under the Obama administration. But fast forward just a few years into the Trump administration, and you can see that around a quarter of German respondents for the past 2 years have seen relations with the United States and the Trump administration as a significant challenge for German foreign policy. What we can see also is that the corona pandemic has exacerbated this trend. We asked in April how the pandemic had changed respondents' opinion of the United States, and you can see very significantly that 73%, almost 3/4, said that their views of the United States had deteriorated in the course of the pandemic. And compare these numbers to people's views on China and the United States. As you can see, none of these actors have come out of the pandemic with a more favorable rating. But I think nonetheless, it's significant to see that with respect to China, for instance, a quarter even improved their opinion of the People's Republic with the EU, there wasn't much change overall. So you can see that, this is something quite specific about the United States. And we want to go into the reasons a little bit. I do not have a crystal ball, but I do think that the numbers allow us, I think, to speculate a little bit about what the reasons for this trend might be. And from our point of view, it probably makes sense to distinguish between the president and some structural reasons. Jacob alluded to this as well. You can see that it's hard to overstate just how unpopular President Trump is in Germany. This is a statistic from last year. We asked what would be the impact on German-US relations if President Trump were re-elected this year. And you can see that almost 9 out of 10 Germans think this would be negative or very negative. From my experience, people inside the administration here in Berlin feel similar about the whole thing, if not in public. Structurally, one thing that we can say is that Germans have very little appreciation of transatlantic relations as a strategic asset. This is the number that Jacob also showed, and you can see that only a bare majority, 52% of Germans think that the troops stationed here are important for German national security. A number I think that is significant with respect to the recent announcement of the Trump administration withdrawing 9,000 troops from Germany. You can also see it with regard to nuclear security, and only approximately 20% are in favor of continuing to rely on the US nuclear umbrella. Actually, by far the most popular option would be to seek nuclear protection from France and the UK. Almost a third would be willing to forego nuclear protection altogether. Perhaps most obvious, this lack of strategic thinking, we think, is in comparing the importance of China versus the United States to Germans. And you can see, in the small numbers that in 2019, this was a question on which respondents leaned quite clearly towards the United States, with 50% saying that it was more important for Germany to have close relations with the United States. That number has decreased significantly, by 13 percentage points. It's increased by 12 percentage points for China. So now that at least in terms of public opinion, we are approaching a situation that is close to equidistance. A second factor, I believe, is a degree of anti-Americanism that is prevalent in German society. And you can see it in this number that Jacob also presented. We've been asking this for some time now, whether Germans would support increasing defense spending. Since 2017, we've consistently had no majority in favor of increasing defense spending. However, last year, we added another question and phrased it slightly differently. And so if you tell Germans that, or if you ask Germans whether we should strive for greater independence from the United States in defense matters, if this meant more than doubling defense spending, all of a sudden you get a majority of 50% who are in favor of such a policy. And for anybody who's followed the German debate on defense spending, you will appreciate just how significant this is, as this country is, and public opinion in particular, is generally very careful about defense spending. Finally, this is one question that we asked last year, and it's whether Germans would prefer a foreign policy that remains anchored in the West, defined as close relations and alignment with the United States and Western Europe, or whether it should adopt a more neutral foreign policy. And again, what we see here is that we have a majority that says, yes, Germany should remain with the West, but you have more than 3 out of 10 Germans who say that they would be in favor of Germany adopting a more neutral foreign policy. Again, a trend which, in terms of transatlantic relations, we feel is quite significant, if not worrying. So to very quickly recap, transatlantic relations clearly are in trouble, a situation that has been exacerbated by COVID-19. This is, from our perspective, is due to the presidency on the one hand, but also structural causes. Among these are a lacking understanding of transatlantic relations as a strategic asset, a degree of anti-Americanism, and potentially, we'll repeat this question this year, also a decreasing commitment to the West. Thank you very much. With that, back to you, Kinga.
Thank you very much, Josh. I think I will give floor now right away to Alena. And so, Alena, do you think how the corona crisis has changed the perceptions of people in Central and Eastern Europe towards the United States, Germany, or broader EU and China? And would you identify the same trends that has been now presented in Central Europe?
Thank you very much, Kinga. Thank you very much, Jacob and Joshua, for giving us this data-grounded perspectives. That's very interesting for us to look at this sitting in Central Europe, because many of the things that we thought were rather unique or idiosyncratic for Central Europe are now very visible, especially in Germany. And I'll talk a little bit later about it. But I wanted also to say that it's a rather strange times that we are living in. We titled this webinar Transatlantic Estrangement, and it is really strange, especially for us in Central Europe, as we're used to thinking that transatlantic relations is the best thing that we have, is the thing that we can always rely on, and it's indeed very strange to see that it might not be the case anymore. In terms of the comparison of the trends and what's happening in Central Europe and how it correlates with the data that we've seen for other countries, we do not have the data that we would compare that would be comparable with the data presented, because we did not do polls in 2020 yet. But we did have polls in 2019 that addressed some of the same questions. So we can extrapolate and combine with the available data that we have for COVID times to see what is comparable. It's interesting that last year, 23% of people on average in Central Europe saw that United States is a threat. Of course, it's very uneven across the countries. If you go to Poland, Poland is very pro-Atlanticist, but if you're in Slovakia, it's a slightly different picture. And only 30% of people last year thought that China is a threat. And it's indeed interesting to see in which direction this changed after the pandemic or during the pandemic. Definitely, we're not in the position to see the full results. We saw the very active public diplomacy of China in Europe in the spring, including the mass diplomacy, the provision of humanitarian aid. And for example, there was a poll in Slovakia in April where 67% of Slovaks said that China is helping the country more than any other actor in the international area, and only 21% of Slovaks responded the same for the EU. Of course, the situation is probably very different now, because for many observers, China has overplayed a little bit its diplomacy in the EU. So we'll definitely need to compare what will be the view in a few months and which country is seen as a better positioned to lead the international affairs. But definitely what is clear is that China's profile has been raised significantly, and China has become a matter of the even public opinion, even in Central Europe, whereas in the past, China was largely not such a visible matter in the public discourse here. Concerning the United States, historically, Central Europeans have been very friendly with the Americans. We have seen Americans as a guarantor of our security here, but we also saw Americans as a founding father of free states of Central Europe. So definitely this perception in many cases still holds, and it differs from country to country. If in Germany we saw that especially President Trump is not necessarily the most liked figure, depending on the general political direction and the who is in power currently in each European country. In some countries, the relations specifically with the Trump administration are as good as ever, and maybe even better than with the previous administrations of the US. But definitely the public opinion is oscillating from country to country. What was probably most interesting for me to see from Joshua's presentation is that a significant number of Germans, every third German, basically thinks that Germany needs to have a more neutral foreign policy. For years, we thought that this is phenomenon very specific for Central Europe. And according to our polls, like half of the people thinks that we should be somewhere between West and East. And we thought that this is a rather big problem, but also maybe an opportunity for political elites and for the governments to work with. But it is indeed troubling to see that the same notions are now also pronounced in Germany, which probably will have significant implications also for international relations. And another important point that's important to mention about Central Europe is that despite what is seen at the headlines in the media, Central Europeans are predominantly pro-European Union. If you ask the people, absolute majority would say that they would like to stay in the European Union, regardless of what is going on between the governments in some of the countries. But that leads me to a few conclusions also from the trends presented earlier. There is a lot of discussion whether after the pandemic the countries will become more inward-looking or they will become more international and there will be more cooperation between the countries. It's interesting to see that Germany seems to have a pole position in being the main protagonist of international cooperation in the future. Because Germans, first, they think that what will going to happen. So they're probably likely to avoid the self-fulfilling prophecy that if you think that cooperation is impossible, we're not going to even try. But also Germans, as we have seen, have a more favorable view of the cooperation. That leaves us with a final question, what exactly we can cooperate on if the lots of things in the transatlantic relations seem to be rather toxic. And my take here, and also that's an extrapolation from the polls, is several issues. First, of course, Joshua presented that Germans think we can cooperate on health. That seems like an obvious issue that we can promote currently, but also climate. In Central Europe, again, we're probably more siding here with the United States in thinking that for most people, climate is a little bit of a too demanding of a topic to have a meaningful conversation now across Atlantic. But also, and that goes back to what Jacob was saying about the United States, it might be important for all sides in this relationship to make a generational bet. Younger people are predominantly interested in climate and they're also interested in technology. These two issues are already the most important topics for the European Union to work on internally and also increasingly externally. So my suggestion would be that given the state of the current transatlantic relations, that the best way to go for all of us would be to take a little bit of this generational bet and focus the relations on the climate and technology, and from that build and extrapolate them also to other areas.
Thank you, Alenka, very much. What I'm taking from the presentation, in a sense, what I also found interesting from Jacob's one, I know that you also, within the framework of your opinion polls, you are also asking Americans and Germans who are their who is their most important partner. And what I found interesting as well, that in the United States, when asking about European countries, the United Kingdom was mentioned on the first place. Lower on the scale, but also on the fourth, I think, was Germany. So my also question asking to you, what do you think would be, given Brexit, what do you think, because by default, if not UK, the most important partner for US in the EU will still be Germany, even though, as you said, the gap is closer. What would be your take on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one. Americans have a fond relationship, let's say, with the UK. All our public opinion polling says that Americans are quite keen on the United Kingdom, even after Brexit, and still look to it as an important foreign policy partner. Now, a lot of that is just built up goodwill because of that special relationship, but it is something to take into account. Germany is you know, of the EU countries we ask about, is sort of second to the UK. I mean, now your country, sorry. But yeah, really in America, the second most important foreign policy partner is China. So even though there's a lot of negative attitudes towards China, a lot of sort of increasing mistrust towards China. Americans still say that China is the second most important foreign policy partner, above Canada, above Germany, above Mexico. So I think, to me, that's a real big dynamic here. It's where China fits in. It's how Americans view China, not only as sort of a trading partner, but also as a competitor, and as potentially sort of even more as we get into this post-coronavirus epidemic, as sort of a global competitor in a way that we might not have seen before. And that's, I think, something that we're trying to track, not just in the US, but in other countries, because we think the global balance of power is such an important story. For many years, Europeans have increasingly said that China is the world's leading economic power, even before this crisis happened. So that movement had already taken place where, in some ways, China was starting to displace the United States as, the leading economy in the world. Now, what happens next, I'm not sure. And what happens when that goes to security issues, when it comes to questions about personal freedoms, human rights? These are all big questions we're really looking to see over the next couple years. And, there's a lot of interesting things happen, and public opinion has shifted as the world has shifted. And I think that's always an interesting thing to track.
Thank you very much. Maybe a follow-up to Joshua. I would be interested in hearing more about the defense. You said that support for more defense spendings in Germany has increased. You mentioned as well the differences in the methodology of the questions asked as well. But maybe I would be provocative here to ask, so do you think the President Trump negotiation techniques work in terms of Germany, of Europe, or taking more defense issue into their hands and investing more? Or is it just the way how the Corona crisis impacted on, have an impact on the relations and the past president and the President Trump presidency on how Germans view the relationship with the United States?
Thank you. Yes, we asked that question for the first time in 2017, and back then you saw 32% in favor of increasing defense spending, and I think in 2018 that number went to 43%, and since then has remained, I think, in the low 40s and high 30s. So I think there are two ways of looking at this question. I think certainly from the US administration's point of view, yes, they would probably argue that, that they've successfully persuaded or left a mark on German public opinion. But I think the competing narrative that has been advanced not only by the chancellor here is that the times when Germany was able to rely on the United States for its protection are over to some degree. That is something that she said already in 2017. And since then, a number of German policymakers have advanced that argument that Germany needs to take on more responsibility, needs to invest more also in its defense. So you can say, it's hard to find out the exact reason, but you could sort of see it from both ways. It's happened because of the Trump administration or despite the Trump administration.
Thank you very much. Alena, maybe now to you. When we talk about transatlantic relations and its bad shape, would you agree that this is also a case in Central Europe? I know you mentioned Slovakia, you mentioned Poland as well, and differences as well. Do you think the COVID-19 has had an impact on this relation, or it will be like before?
I think there's definitely understanding, and that's not necessarily the new thing with the COVID-19, but COVID-19 has made it more pronounced. There's definitely an understanding that the US is no longer an uncontested superpower. And whether we like it or not, we have to live with this new reality. Definitely, especially with the COVID-19, what people base on their opinion to a large degree is the comparison towards the current situation related to the COVID-19 pandemic and how different countries are coping with it. And Central Europe so far has been a rather successful case. in terms of the numbers of infections and in terms of the numbers of deaths. Just now, before the start of the webinar, we were discussing that in Slovakia, in Bratislava, life is pretty much back to normal, which is definitely not the case currently in the US. And for Central Europeans, there is this understanding that the region has done better, not just than the US, but also better than some of the Western European countries. So there is this increasing understanding that something is not necessarily perfect on the other side. And this also translates into the perception of the relations, where the increasingly slightly erratic decisions by the administration are resonating with people. And I'm not even talking about the bigger decisions about, for example, trade issues, but there are also small things that people notice the most. For example, decisions on visas, which for people, these are the issues that resonate best with their daily lives and that they sense the best. So definitely there is a perception that something is not entirely right. Whether the reasons for this perception are the same ones that are perceived by the policymakers and people who are directly dealing with the United States on the governmental levels, they might not be the same reasons, but there is definitely the shared perception.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Jacob.
Thanks. Yeah, just on that point, Elena's last point, you know, American soft power, you know, the pop culture kind of ties between the world has always been perceived by other countries as basically its strongest asset over, you know, over other issues such as democracy building or democracy promotion abroad, or even like business ties. It's that soft power elements that, you know, form the basis of a lot of American power projection around the world. And as Elena said, that might be something we see is weakened the most by this. You know, the security perceptions are one thing, and policymakers think a lot about that, but you know, individuals think a lot about you know, pop culture, economy. Those are the things that really hit them most. And when you see weakening of those aspects of American power, you sort of see, you know, the potential for even more. And that's to me an interesting question that we'll, you know, try to assess over the next years, is how much those soft power elements of American power have really been damaged by this crisis.
Very interesting. I will bring now our colleague, Zuzanna Pison, and I will appeal also to our participants to think about any further questions they might have for our excellent panel, and I will be happy to ask them for you.
Okay, so hello everyone. Jacob, Josh, thank you so much for your inputs. I think that the results of your research very much reflect and also kind of translate into what we've been working on here in Globsec, as we're currently putting together our report called Megatrends 2020, which is supposed to reflect on those new developments after the pandemic. But in comparison with your research, it's much more, I would say, broad, as it's really supposed to reflect all sorts of economic and security issues, and really give policy recommendations on those problems. And I would in particular like to point out two of the trends which we have identified, which very much converge with what you came up with in your research. For example, the first one is the shifting global balance of power. And then the second one is the, I would say, the under-delivering populism, especially related to the negative use of Trump administration. So when it comes to the shifting global balance of power, so what we came up with as part of our Megatrends exercise is that we'll be exploring the, especially kind of from like a more economic perspective. So we'll be looking at the increased pressure on corporation to switch to more robust domestic supply chains, and kind of like reducing dependence on an increasingly fractured global supply chain system. And what I would be really interested in, what are the unique US and German perspectives on that? So that's kind of the first point. And then the second point would be the point that we're further exploring in our Megatrends report is that we believe, or like we assume, that people will eventually become tired of under-delivering populism. And while populist actors and rhetoric keep winning across the world, crises keep uncovering that the power some leaders have lies primarily in their words and not actions. And we can see that in the declining preference of Trump's administration as well. So I would be really interested in your ideas, what you think, whether societies where crisis was handled well, whether the rise of nationalism and isolationism will keep winning the hearts and minds. So if you have any views on either one of those questions, I'll be really curious to hear your perspectives.
Thank you very much, Susanna. Thank you also for introducing our crowdsourcing intelligence exercise that we are now undergoing. And we will be happy also for Jacob and Josh to hear your answer to Susanna's questions and remarks. And later I will give the floor to Alena.
Sure, I can just go first. In terms of the global balance of power, we've been tracking whether countries say that the US or China is the leading economic power for many years now. And an interesting thing that we found here is that while most of the countries around the world in which we ask these surveys continue to say the US is the world's leading economic power, we've really seen a rapid shift in European opinions on this, where Europeans have much more rapidly sort of taken to the idea that China is the world's leading economy, even as perceptions of China have not improved really very much. In other words, there's a decoupling between China's image as an economic powerhouse and its sort of what it could be perceived as a superpower. And in fact, when we ask people, directly, would you rather have the US or China as a leading superpower, they still say the US by overwhelming majorities. That's of last year. Whether that's changed now or not is another question. But yeah, generally, when you look at the economic aspect of it, China's been gaining in the minds of people for many years. And people like trade generally. When we ask about whether people want to trade with other countries, there's a lot of positivity. But once you get down to the details of trade, there is some doubts about how certain countries can potentially take advantage of other countries through how they, have tariffs and all those other things. And that is definitely a sticking point with certain publics. On the populist angle, I mean, we've found differences between supporters of populist parties and non-supporters across Europe for many years. They diverge on a lot of issues, from views of the EU to trade to views towards minority groups, Muslims, homosexuals, Roma, Jews, that kind of thing. So we do see quite a divergence between populism and not. But in the end, in the countries where populist parties still have control, a lot of it's just economics. People, when the economy is doing well, tend to support the parties in power, regardless of whether, how democratic they are. When we ask about democracy in general, people like democracy. They like the thought of expressing themselves, of being able to be, open in public. But if it's gonna, cost them economic issues, then we see less commitment to some of the values of democracy. So I think populism is something which has shown, how sometimes preeminent those economic attitudes are. And that's an important point when it comes to China as well. So I know those are a lot of thoughts all at once, but that's what I think about on those two issues.
Should I come in on that?
Yes, Josh, go ahead.
Thanks, Susanna. And I guess those were a couple of questions, but I'll start with China perhaps. This one statistic that 36% of Germans think that having close relations with China is more important than having close relations with the United States is something that caused a bit of a media stir, at least here in Germany this year. But I think it's important to read that question closely. And I think it points to China's growing importance in public opinion, but not necessarily to sympathy or positive attitudes towards the People's Republic, we also, I didn't present this now, but in the past few years, we've also asked people how they feel about China's growing international influence. That number has very consistently been in the low double digits. It's usually around 11 or 12% who say that China's growing influence is a positive thing. Kinga, I think you mentioned China's mask diplomacy. And that was it 67% of Slovakians who said that China had done most to help other European countries in the context of the pandemic. And that is quite interesting because we asked a very similar question here, and that was whether Germans thought that it was China or the EU and its member states who had done most to solve the pandemic. And it was 3/4, 75% who said that the EU and its member states had done more to contribute towards solving the pandemic. So again, you see that, there's a growing appreciation of China's importance, but that doesn't necessarily tell you about, whether China is perceived more as a partner or a rival, something in between. You also mentioned supply chains. Again, we have a similar number. We asked Germans whether or not they thought that we should relocate critical infrastructure, critical goods, including medical goods, to Germany, even if this meant increased costs. And in the context of the pandemic, I mean, this was early April, so I think there was still a lot of uncertainty, and that may be reflected in the answer as well. But 85% said that they would be in favor of relocating critical goods. I think that's all from my part.
Thank you very much. Alena, I will let you respond to any questions that were or comments that were made, but I will also add one aspect and on Russia. We've talked China, we've talked EU, we've talked Germany, but I haven't heard for 45 minutes now Russia as a important global player. Would you have any comments on this issue?
Yes, for a Central European, it's also very puzzling to see where Russia has disappeared from the public opinion. Because for location reasons, for historical reasons, we still are convinced that Russia is very important, for good or bad, but it is there. But this is definitely the growing trend, is that for the rest of the world, Russia is becoming more and more irrelevant. Definitely, this is partially associated with the Russian not such a good handling of the pandemic. Also with the Russian economic decline, and the combination of the two make Russia much less visible on the international arena because they were too preoccupied with the domestic effort, but also objectively with the ascendance of China, but also other states, the share of Russia, both economically and politically in the global system is becoming smaller and smaller. For Central Europeans, it's very hard, I think, mentally to understand that this is what is happening, because there is still historical reaction to treat Russia as probably a very important actor, but it is definitely the trend that is visible in other countries. I would like to also very quickly comment on the question about supply chains, and it's not based on the opinion polls, but it's more based on the economic processes that are going on in Central Europe. Part of the discussion that is associated with the relocation of supply chains is whether they should be going back to Germany or to the United States, or whether we can have a more what we would call democratic supply chains, and that would be, they would be relocated to countries maybe that are politically more predictable, more stable and friendlier than China. And for Central Europeans, definitely the crucial question is whether both the United States and Western Europe would consider Central Europe as a potential place where the supply chains can be relocated. For me, that would also be the most important for people's statement of the importance of the transatlantic relations. If we still count European Union as a whole and the United States as a shared and trusted economic space, it means that we do have rather good transatlantic relations, and that this transatlantic relations actually works. Kinga, you're muted.
Thank you. I saw expression in your faces as well when I mentioned Russia. Josh and Jacob, would you like to comment on it? How did it reflected in your latest opinion polls, and what's your take and the perspectives from your countries on Russia's role on the global stage? And let me also ask two questions, actually three ones from the chat. I feel they are all to Jacob, and first is related to feelings of Americans toward the European, if Europeans should spend more on defense, and the perceptions of during the Trump and Obama administration, and the same goes for American feelings about the economy. Does it depend on the party of power, and if the last the incumbent administration insistence on this issue has changed the perception? And one more question about the foreign policy and its role in the US elections, and to what extent it's likely to matter in the upcoming elections, and on what foreign policy issues exactly, or if any, do you think it will feature? And then Jacob and Josh as well.
Okay, that was a good number of questions, so hopefully I can get to them, but let me know if I miss one. On Russia, I mean, we've seen for many years, global opinion of Russia is not positive. It's Putin is not, there's not a lot of confidence in him to do the right thing in world affairs. So in terms of public opinion towards Russia, it hasn't been you know, seen as positive as China in many ways over the last couple of years. And that continues to this day. In terms of American public opinion towards Russia, it's very low. But the only thing that's interesting there is that a couple of years ago, there was a switch where Republicans became more positive on Russia when the Trump administration came in than they were before. It wasn't particularly high ratings for Russia, but it was a switch that happened. But generally, Americans don't have a lot of positive views towards Russia, and that's pretty much the same for most of the rest of the world. And many Central and Eastern Europeans also still continue to view Russia as a threat, and that hasn't changed much either, especially in the post-Crimean annexation time period. In terms of defense spending, I don't have a lot of comparable data from the Obama administration in terms of how Americans think. I only have it from the Trump administration. And again, what we found is that increasingly fewer Americans say that Europe should spend more on defense compared to the beginning of the administration. So that's an issue that had a little more prominence at the beginning of the Trump administration. It's sort of diminished since. Same thing with NATO. We see very positive views towards NATO in many of the member states. I know Globsec has also done research in this regard. NATO is seen as a pretty strong entity, but there is a little less commitment to actually invoking Article 5 should there be an attack by Russia. So we asked a question on whether countries would they help another country that was attacked that was within NATO, and many said that they would not. But at the same time, they still said that the United States would come to their aid. So there still is a sense that Americans would come to the aid if it comes down to a military confrontation. But that is something that is also, could change over time and would be interesting to look through. Just pivoting to the U.S. election, I don't think foreign policy is going to play much of a role in the election, with the probably large exception of China. So far, that is an issue that both sides have tried to play up on. I know Trump has sort of, tried to paint Biden as sort of weak on China, and I think there's a lot of issues when it comes to the relationship between the United States and China that will be in play for this election, whether it's on tariffs, whether it's about the origins of the coronavirus pandemic, or whether it's on the sort of South China Sea issues that you saw the Secretary of State talk about in the last day. So I do think if any foreign policy issue comes up, it will be China, but overall, usually domestic issues, racial relations in the US, economic relations, and of course the pandemic will take priority in any US election. But that's why elections are held. It's always interesting to see how the campaigns take different tacks about this. But the China issue is not one that's going to go away or be relegated to the side in this election. based on what I know.
Thank you very much, Jacob. This is really interesting. We in Central Europe, we just had one big elections in Poland, and I feel like this time actually foreign policy and the visit that President Duda paid to Washington played a role. U.S. Polish people living in the U.S. They support the law and justice government, and this was a part of the campaign. But I also felt this was unique, and I also feel like many topics that are, on the other hand, come up in the campaigns, then they're abandoned completely. LGBT issues in Poland, and they I feel like in a month or two we will not talk about the same issues that we have been discussing in the past month. So I will now give a floor to Josh. I have a follow-up questions from our audience, so feel free to pick up and answer any of those. We also have only 5 minutes left for our discussion. So then I will start with the reverse order, starting with Alena to give a final conclusions of today's meeting. And I would like to ask you as well, because I feel like we have been to end on the more positive note, or what's the future will bring, and can we expect actually more enthusiasm and more support for transatlantic cooperation? Josh, on everything that we said, plus we have a question about the German foreign policy post Merkel. Any thoughts, and what is your projection?
Sure, thank you very much. On Russia, we asked in September what was more important, similar or analogous to the China question. We asked Germans what was more important to them, having close relations to Russia or to the United States. And we then got 39% to 25% who said it was more important having close relations to the United States. So you see a majority that's in favor of transatlantic relations. However, I think something that was interesting about that is, on the one hand, that you had almost the result almost in reverse in the Länder that form part of the old GDR. I think there was 38 to 23% who said it was more important having close relations to Russia. And another point that is interesting is that this appreciation of close importance to Russia is something that seems to be important both to the fringes on the right and on the left. So it's something that's shared by both the AfD in Germany and the left, Die Linke. I think they had respectively 46 and 44% who said that close relations with Russia were more important. Apart from that, I think, whatever you will make of that, but you also note that Russia is somewhat absent from the responses. So we also asked, of course, about Germany's most important foreign policy partners, but I think it was something like 4% or so who answered that Russia was among Germany's most important foreign policy partners. It was a bit higher again in the East with 9%, but again, that is not a particularly high number. But the same holds true on the other hand. If you ask about the most important threats or challenges to German policy, we, as mentioned in the beginning, you see almost a quarter saying relations with the United States and the Trump administration. But Russia is not considered among the top 3 or top 5 even threats to Germany. That on Russia. On a future German foreign policy, I mean, again, I don't have a crystal ball. I think there's been a lot of pressure on the chancellor to reverse its course, her course on China, and to adopt a bit more of a critical, perhaps a bit more of a distance position vis-a-vis China. She's so far resisted that pretty successfully. I think the UK announced today that it will more or less exclude Huawei from the building of its 5G infrastructure. We've seen critical voices of Huawei grow, obviously both from the US, but also within Europe. So perhaps that will make a difference. Post the election next year, it's a bit hard to tell. Laschet certainly during his time as First Minister of North Rhine-Westphalia, he's placed a lot of emphasis on economic aspects. We had a question actually last year where I think it was 76% of Germans said that the German government vis-a-vis China should put more emphasis on its political interests, even if that came at an economic cost. I don't think that that is the course that Laschet would go for, if I can put it that way.
Thank you very much. Now we can start the round of the last closing remarks, and please keep them brief, maybe 1 minute maximum, so we don't keep our participants and we finish on time. Alena, go ahead.
I want to finish on the positive note. We started by saying that transatlantic relations in a bad shape, but I wanted to make an example of the European Union to show that this is probably reversible. The original response of the European Union was admittedly not very well coordinated, not very visible, but then the EU already started pulling itself together and coming up with a much stronger response. So we will see what the Council meeting at the end of this week will deliver, but definitely it's not set in stone that the current trend will continue. So we definitely have an opportunity to improve it. Also, I wanted to quote here Angela Merkel, since we're talking about Germany, who said that, yes, we will all probably might be a bit more nationalistic, but nation state has no future standing alone. And I think if we understand that, and for big countries, of course, we understand that in connection to China, but especially for small countries in Central Europe, we understand it very well that no country in today's world on itself has much future in its standing in the international affairs. So I'm rather positive about it.
Thank you, Elena. Jacob?
So, I mean, we do surveys every year tracking the international image of the United States. I'm particularly interested to see what will happen this year in terms of, confidence in the U.S. president and U.S. favorability. I'm not as optimistic that it will rebound anytime soon, but we have seen in the past that massive shifts in public opinion can happen when there's a change in the US presidency. And if that does happen this year, I would expect at least some sort of rebound in terms of public opinion towards the US. But I do think that some of the issues that have popped up over the last couple of years might last a little longer than a presidential term, might need a little more in terms of repairing. But on the US side, looking at the positives, Americans still see, strong allies in Europe, UK, Germany, France, still, Canada. And when you're looking at like democracies around the world, Canada, Japan, Australia, Americans still have very positive opinions of these countries. And I think those types of alliances from an American perspective have not changed much over the last years, despite the rhetoric that you see from the current administration. So I am hopeful in terms of Americans' outlook on the world over the next couple of years. Whether that conforms to people outside the US, let's wait and see.
Thank you very much. And the final comments to Josh.
I don't think I have much to add to Jacob's comments. Perhaps just one more thing. I think on the future of foreign policy and also public opinion, I think foreign policy may not play a big role in the debates in the US election. Jacob said with the exception of China, but I think it'll have a big consequence also for Europeans, of course. I think there has been more cooperation between the US and the respective European administrations than is visible on the media surface, but I think nonetheless that the at times somewhat hostile rhetoric we've seen from Washington, I think just makes it very difficult to find a common strategic approach towards China. So, even if in the debate the foreign policy is not going to play a big role, I think whether or not we manage to come together on a positive agenda for transatlantic relations in the next administration is also going to have a big impact on German and other European countries' position.
Thank you very much. On behalf of Globsec, Pew Research Center, and the Körber Foundation, I would like to thank all participants for joining us this afternoon and this morning. I'm looking forward for your next opinion polls, and we will be happy to present them as well in the same shape when they are due in the future. I would like to thank all panelists for their interventions and presentations and valuable comments. And I wish you all a pleasant evening and day. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.